The avalanche warning bell in Copper Vein Basin had already stopped ringing by the time Ephraim Doyle understood what that silence really meant. Snow was coming down so thick across the eastern slope that the church steeple in town had disappeared before noon, and the wind rolling off Kestrel Mountain carried a low grinding sound that no man in that valley had ever wanted to hear twice in one lifetime. Ephraim, a 34-year-old blacksmith with soot-cracked hands and a limp from a hammer accident 2 winters back, stood at the edge of his cabin porch with his youngest daughter clinging to his coat and his old blue-tick hound, Juno, pressed hard against his knee. The dog would not stop staring at the tree line to the north, not toward the road, not toward the neighbors, north, toward the black cliff face nobody in Copper Vein Basin ever spoke about after dark. Ephraim already knew the mountain above their cabin was loose. He had felt the small tremors under the floorboards 2 nights running. He had watched icicles snap off the eaves without any wind to shake them. And now, with the storm swallowing the valley whole and the temperature dropping faster than any thermometer he owned could track, he understood that staying inside the cabin might mean being buried inside it. His wife Hannah stood in the doorway behind him, one hand gripping the frame, the other resting protectively on the shoulder of their oldest boy, Silas. Their 2 younger children waited by the stove, wrapped in every blanket the family owned. Ephraim had one decision left to make, and the mountain was not going to give him long to make it. That was when Juno bolted off the porch. She did not run toward the road. She did not run toward the barn. She tore straight through the deep snow toward the cliff face, the same cliff face every old-timer in Copper Vein Basin swore had swallowed men whole for the better part of 40 years. Ephraim called after the dog once, then twice, then not at all. Because through the roar of the storm and the deep, low grinding coming off the mountain, he heard something else, something impossible in weather like this. A soft, warm hiss, rising up out of the frozen earth somewhere near the base of that forbidden cliff. Steam. Real steam, curling up through the snow in a thin white column that the wind could not tear apart. Is there truly a warm refuge hidden inside a cave the whole valley refused to enter, or has Ephraim just led his family toward the very thing every neighbor warned him about? Don't let the Doyle family face the avalanche alone. Hit that like button and subscribe so their story of survival can reach every viewer who needs to hear it tonight. Only 12 hours earlier, Ephraim Doyle had still believed he had time. Time to reinforce the north wall of the cabin. Time to move the last of the salted venison down into the cold cellar. Time to ride the 6 miles into town and buy the extra lamp oil Hannah had asked for twice already that week. Copper Vein Basin was not a forgiving place, but the Doyle family had lived along its eastern ridge for almost 11 years, and Ephraim had learned to read its moods the way other men learned to read scripture. He knew when a February thaw was a lie. He knew when a September calm meant an October flood. He knew the difference between snow that settled and snow that hunted. And by sunrise that morning, watching the sky curdle over Kestrel Mountain, he had already known that the storm rolling in was not the ordinary kind. The trouble was, Ephraim was not the only man in Copper Vein Basin who had noticed. 2 days before the avalanche warning bell fell silent, the mining company that owned most of the western slope had begun quietly pulling their crews down out of the higher shafts. Nobody in town had been told why. The saloon rumor was that a survey engineer named Corbin Vale had walked the upper ridge with a set of instruments most men in the valley had never seen before, and had come back down white-faced and refusing to answer questions. Whatever Corbin Vale had measured up there, he had shared it only with the mine foreman and the sheriff, and neither man had spoken a word of it publicly since. Ephraim had heard the rumors the same as everyone else, but rumors did not stack firewood or seal window frames. So he had spent that morning working. He had chopped a fresh cord of pine behind the barn until his shoulders burned. He had checked the tightness of every shutter along the north wall of the cabin. He had oiled the hinges on the storm door twice, because a frozen hinge in a blizzard could cost a man his fingers before it cost him anything else. Hannah had baked 2 loaves of dark rye bread and wrapped them in cloth for the cold pantry, and Silas, only 13 years old but already tall enough to reach the top shelf of the tool wall, had spent the morning helping his father drag the sled load of hay from the barn into the cabin's mudroom. Livestock could not be saved in weather this bad, but a family that stayed warm and fed could last 3 days on almost nothing. The younger children, Ada and little Wren, had stayed close to the stove all morning. Ada was 9, quiet by nature, the kind of child who noticed things adults missed. Wren was barely 5 and still young enough to believe that her father could fix any problem the sky decided to send them. Neither girl had complained about the cold seeping through the floorboards, though Ephraim had seen Ada glance up at the ceiling more than once when the beams began creaking under the weight of the growing snow load. That look bothered him. Children who had grown up in Copper Vein Basin already knew what a groaning roof beam meant. Ada had lived through the collapse of the Hollies family barn 2 winters back. She remembered. By 11 o'clock that morning, Ephraim had climbed the ladder to the roof one last time to knock down the heaviest snow buildup near the chimney. The air up there had felt wrong. Not just cold, charged, like the moment before a lightning strike, only without the smell of ozone. He had stood on the frozen shingles for a long time, staring north toward the black cliff face, and he had felt Juno watching him from the yard the whole time. The dog had refused to come inside. Ephraim had noticed that too. Juno had never once, in 6 years of hard Wyoming winters, refused to come inside when called. That was the first sign he should have listened to. The second came just after noon, when the avalanche warning bell in town began ringing. The Copper Vein Basin bell was rung by hand from the church tower whenever the mine foreman received reliable word that the upper slope had begun to shift. Ephraim had heard it exactly 4 times in 11 years. Twice the warning had come to nothing. Once it had preceded a slide that buried a section of the wagon road for 2 weeks. Once it had preceded the loss of 3 men above the timberline whose bodies had not been recovered until the following June. When the bell began ringing that morning, Ephraim had counted the strikes. 9, then 12. Then it had stopped, not tapered off, stopped, as if someone in the tower had simply let go of the rope and walked away. That was worse than the ringing itself. A bell that stopped mid-warning meant one of 2 things. Either the man ringing it had run out of time, or the storm had already reached him. Ephraim had come down off the roof so fast he had nearly torn the ladder loose from the frozen ground. He had gone straight into the cabin and told Hannah, without raising his voice, that they were going to prepare the cellar. Hannah had not asked why. She had simply nodded once and begun gathering the children's coats. The cellar under the Doyle cabin was a good one, dug 6 feet deep into the packed clay, lined with cedar planks Ephraim had cut himself. It could hold the family for a night, maybe 2. But Ephraim knew, even as he pulled the trapdoor open and began lowering blankets down the ladder, that a cellar under a cabin was still tied to the cabin above it. If the roof came down, the cellar became a coffin. If the avalanche reached them from the north slope, the cellar became a stone jar sealed from the outside. He had watched too many men in this valley die trusting the wrong kind of shelter. That was when Juno started barking, not the ordinary bark she gave at deer or wandering elk. This was the deep chest-heavy warning bark she had used exactly once before, the night a black bear had come sniffing around the smokehouse 2 autumns earlier. Ephraim had stopped mid-motion on the cellar ladder, one hand still gripping a folded quilt, and he had listened. The sound was coming from the yard, from the direction of the tree line, from the north. He had climbed back out of the cellar without saying a word to Hannah and stepped onto the porch. The snow was falling so thick by then that he could barely see the barn, but Juno was there at the edge of the yard, planted stiff-legged in the drifts, her nose pointed straight toward the black cliff face beyond the pines. The dog was not looking at the mountain the way she looked at wolves or coyotes. She was looking at it the way she looked at a door somebody had forgotten to close. Focused. Certain. As if there was something on the other side of that snow that she already knew about, and she was only waiting for Ephraim to catch up. He had almost called her back. Almost. But then the ground had trembled beneath his boots, not violently, just enough to send a thin cascade of snow sliding off the porch roof, just enough to make the barn door swing an inch on its hinge. Just enough to make Ephraim understand that whatever the mine foreman had feared, whatever Corbin Vale had measured on that upper ridge 2 days earlier, had finally arrived. The mountain above Copper Vein Basin was moving, and it was going to keep moving until it reached the valley floor. Ephraim had turned back toward the cabin door and shouted for Hannah to bring the children up out of the cellar. His voice had cracked in a way it had not cracked since his own father died. Hannah had not asked questions. She had climbed the ladder with little Wren already bundled against her chest, and Silas had come up behind her with Ada tucked under one arm and the family's kerosene lantern gripped hard in his free hand. The boy had understood without being told. In a valley like this, 13 years old was not really a child anymore. They had gathered in the yard within 2 minutes. Ephraim had counted them by touch as much as by sight because the snow was falling too fast for a man to trust his own eyes. Hannah, Silas, Ada, Wren. Juno was still at the tree line, still barking, still refusing to come. Ephraim had wanted with every part of him to run in the opposite direction, down toward the road, down toward the wagon path, down toward the neighbors on the lower ridge who would take his family in without asking, but the road led south. And south meant crossing directly beneath the western slope, directly beneath the moving mountain. North meant the Black Cliff. North meant the place old men in Copper Vein Basin crossed themselves before speaking about. North meant every warning Ephraim had heard for 11 years about caves that swallowed men and never gave them back. But north also meant the direction Juno was pointing. And north was the direction the thin white column of steam was rising from, straight up through the snow, defying the wind, refusing to scatter. Ephraim had stared at that column of steam for perhaps 3 heartbeats. Then he had made his decision. He had picked up little Wren from Hannah's arms, tied a length of rope from his own belt to Hannah's, then from Hannah's to Silas's, then from Silas's to Ada's, and he had started walking north through the deep snow toward the cliff face and the dog and the steam. Hannah had asked him once, quietly, if he knew what he was doing. Ephraim had answered her honestly. He had told her no. He had told her that the mountain to the south was going to bury the road within the hour, and the cabin within the day, and possibly the cellar within the week, and that the only direction left to walk was the one direction every man in the valley had told him never to walk. Hannah had squeezed his gloved hand once through the rope, and she had not asked again. The walk to the cliff face took nearly 40 minutes, though on a clear day a man could have covered the same distance in 15. Snow gathered above their knees within the first 100 yards. Wind cut sideways across the open pasture with enough force to knock little Wren's hood loose twice, and each time Ephraim had to stop, shift the child against his chest, and refasten the ties before her ears froze. Behind him, Hannah moved with the steady patience of a woman who had already accepted that panic would kill her family faster than the cold ever could. Silas kept his lantern low and shielded against the wind. Ada, small as she was, never once fell behind. That surprised Ephraim. Later, he would come to understand that Ada had been watching Juno the whole time, and Juno had been watching the cliff, and Ada had trusted the dog the way children sometimes trust animals more completely than they trust adults. The column of steam grew clearer with every step. From a distance, it had looked like a thin white thread rising through the snowfall. Up close it revealed itself as something denser, something alive, curling and folding on itself the way smoke did over a well-tended forge. Ephraim knew what steam looked like. Steam meant warmth. Warmth meant water above freezing. And water above freezing in the middle of a Wyoming blizzard at the base of a cliff face nobody in Copper Vein Basin had willingly entered in 40 years meant something very specific. Something the old-timers in the valley had probably always known and had chosen, for reasons of their own, never to explain. The cliff itself loomed larger as they approached, black and jagged against the white storm, cut through with veins of quartz that caught the weak gray light, and reflected it back in scattered flickers. Juno was already at the base of it by the time Ephraim reached her, digging furiously at a patch of snow banked against the rock wall. The dog had cleared away nearly a foot of powder, and beneath the snow, Ephraim could see the dark shape of an opening. Not a wide opening, not the mouth of a proper cave, something narrower. A cleft in the rock face, maybe 2 feet across at its widest point, angling downward into the mountain at a shallow slope. The steam was rising directly out of it. Ephraim knelt beside the dog and placed one gloved hand near the opening. Warm air brushed his wrist. Not hot, warm. The kind of warmth that a man's body remembered from summer evenings on a porch. He turned to Hannah and told her without wasting words that they were going inside. Hannah looked at the cleft in the rock, then at the children, then back at Ephraim. She nodded once. Silas stepped forward with the lantern and Ephraim took it from him. Then he handed Ren back to Hannah, dropped to his knees, and pushed the lantern ahead of him into the opening. The passage was tight for the first 4 or 5 feet. Ephraim had to crawl on his stomach with the lantern held out in front of him, and twice his coat caught on jagged edges of quartz that scraped along his ribs. But then the passage widened. Not suddenly, gradually, like a throat opening into a chest. Within another 12 feet he could rise to a crouch. Within 20 he could stand fully upright. And when he lifted the lantern above his head, the light spread outward across a chamber that stopped him where he stood. The cave was larger than any cellar Ephraim had ever dug, larger than the barn behind his cabin. The ceiling arched above him in a rough dome shape, blackened in places by what might once have been old cook fires, and the walls glimmered faintly with the same veins of quartz that ran through the cliff face outside. But it was not the size of the chamber that stopped him. It was the sound, a soft, steady, gurgling sound coming from somewhere deeper inside. And it was the smell. Warm mineral, faintly sulfurous, the way a hot bath smelled when a man dropped a piece of iron into it. Ephraim moved the lantern slowly across the far wall of the chamber, and there, cut into the stone floor at the back of the cave, he saw it. A pool. Steam rising off its surface in slow curling ribbons. Ephraim did not move for a long moment. He simply stood there with the lantern raised, watching the steam rise off the pool, listening to the soft gurgle of water bubbling somewhere beneath the stone. Then he turned and called back through the passage for Hannah to bring the children inside. His voice echoed strangely in the chamber, as if the walls themselves absorbed part of the sound before letting it return. Hannah's answer came muffled from the entrance, but he heard the rope shifting as she began to move. Getting the children through the narrow passage took time. Silas came first, thin enough to slip through easily, dragging a small canvas satchel of provisions Hannah had grabbed from the mudroom at the last minute. Ada followed, silent and careful, her small hands feeling along the cold rock as she crawled. Ren cried once when the tight passage pressed against her shoulders, but Hannah spoke to her softly the whole way through, and by the time they emerged into the chamber, the little girl had stopped crying and started staring. Staring the way children stare at a thing they have never been told exists. Juno came last, squeezing through with a low grumble, and once inside she shook the snow off her coat in a violent spray that hissed faintly when the droplets hit the warmer stone. Hannah stood in the middle of the chamber and simply looked. She did not speak for perhaps a full minute. Ephraim watched her face in the lantern light and understood that she was working through the same series of realizations he had worked through only moments before. First, the size of the space. Second, the temperature. Third, the pool. Fourth, the implication. She turned to him finally and asked, very quietly, whether he thought anyone else knew this place existed. Ephraim did not answer right away, because he had already begun to notice things his first sweep of the lantern had missed. The old cook fires along one wall were not random. They had been arranged in a rough semicircle, the kind of arrangement men made when they intended to return to a place more than once. The floor near the pool had been worn smooth in patches, the way stone wore smooth only under years of repeated foot traffic. And along the far wall, half hidden behind a natural shelf of rock, Ephraim could see the shape of something that did not belong in a natural cave, something rectangular, something made by human hands. He walked toward it slowly, lantern held high. The shape resolved itself as he approached. A wooden crate, or what remained of one, the boards warped and darkened by decades of steam but still holding together. And beside the crate, folded neatly against the wall as if placed there deliberately by someone who had expected to come back for it, lay a heavy oiled canvas tarp. Ephraim knelt and touched the canvas. It was dry, warm, perfectly preserved by the constant temperature of the chamber. He lifted a corner of the tarp and pulled it back. Beneath it lay a stack of tools, old tools. A mining pick with a hickory handle darkened by sweat, a pair of iron tongs, a hand-forged skillet blackened by use, a tin coffee pot with the lid still fastened, and beside them, wrapped in another layer of oiled cloth, a small leather-bound book. Ephraim picked the book up carefully. The leather was soft and warm from the chamber's heat. He opened the front cover and held it near the lantern. The first page carried a name written in faded brown ink, Josiah Vane. Below the name, a date, October 1878. Ephraim stared at that date for a long moment. Almost 50 years ago. He had heard the name Josiah Vane only once in his life, spoken by an old prospector at the general store when Ephraim was still new to the valley. The prospector had said Josiah Vane was one of the men who had disappeared into the Black Cliff during the first hard winter after the mine opened, and that his name was not to be spoken lightly by anyone who wanted to keep their luck. Ephraim had thought it was superstition. Now, holding the man's journal in his hands inside the very cave the old-timers had warned him against, he was not so certain. Hannah came up beside him and looked at the book. She asked what it was. Ephraim told her. Hannah did not respond immediately. She simply looked at the book, then at the crate, then at the pool of steaming water at the back of the chamber. Finally, she asked Ephraim to read it aloud. Not all of it. Just enough to know whether the man who had written it had been running from something, or preparing for something, or dying inside this cave. Ephraim understood the question. In a valley like Copper Vein Basin, a journal left behind by a man who had vanished could mean any of those three things, and each one carried a different weight for the people who came after. He sat down on the warm stone floor with his back against the rock wall and opened the journal near the lantern. Silas settled beside him, close enough to see the pages. Ada moved to sit near Hannah, and little Wren, exhausted from the walk through the snow, had already curled herself against Juno's flank near the pool and fallen asleep. That surprised Ephraim more than anything else that had happened since leaving the cabin. A 5-year-old child, dropped into a strange cave in the middle of a blizzard, had gone to sleep within minutes. The warmth of the chamber had done that. The warmth and something else, something in the quiet. Ephraim began to read. Josiah Vane's handwriting was cramped and slanted, the kind of writing produced by a man who had learned his letters late in life and had never fully trusted them. But the words were clear enough. The first entries were dated in the autumn of 1878, and they described, in plain and unadorned language, the discovery of the cave itself. Josiah had been a solitary trapper working the north face of Kestrel Mountain that fall. He had followed a wounded elk into the tree line during an early snowstorm, and the elk had led him to the base of the Black Cliff. There the animal had collapsed, and Josiah, kneeling to finish it, had felt warm air rising from a crack in the rock beside him. He had spent the rest of that day widening the crack with his skinning knife. By nightfall, he had crawled inside for the first time. The next several entries describe the chamber the way a man describes a thing he can barely believe he has found. Josiah had written about the pool, about the steam, about the way the walls held heat even on the coldest nights. He had written about the mineral taste of the water, faintly bitter, faintly metallic, but drinkable once boiled. He had written about the fact that the air in the chamber, though warm, was never stale, and that somewhere deeper in the rock there had to be a natural vent carrying old air out and drawing fresh air in. That last observation stopped Ephraim, because it meant Josiah Vane had been more than a trapper. He had been the kind of man who noticed things. The kind of man who might have survived a winter in a place like this if the winter had let him. Ephraim skipped ahead several pages. The middle entries turned practical. Josiah had begun using the cave as a winter camp. He had hauled provisions in over the course of 2 autumns, storing salt pork and dried corn in the wooden crate. He had learned to bank the cook fires against the wall so that the smoke drew upward through the natural vent instead of gathering along the ceiling. He had discovered that the pool itself, though too hot to bathe in near its center, was cool enough at its edges to soak sore hands and feet after a long day in the snow. He had written, in one entry Ephraim read twice, that the cave had saved his life during the winter of 1880, when a storm had trapped him on the mountain for 11 straight days. Then the tone of the journal changed. The entries from the winter of 1881 grew shorter, more anxious, less concerned with the practical management of the cave and more concerned with something else. Josiah had begun writing about voices, not voices in the cave itself, voices from the valley below. He had written that men from the newly opened mining camp had begun asking questions in town about the Black Cliff face, and that one of them, a company surveyor whose name Josiah did not record, had followed Josiah's tracks up the mountain twice that winter. Ephraim paused with his finger between the pages. He looked up at Hannah, who was watching him closely, and then at Silas, who had not moved since the reading began. The boy's eyes were fixed on the journal with the kind of focus Ephraim only ever saw when Silas was working through something he did not fully understand. Hannah asked, quietly, why a surveyor from the mining camp would have followed a trapper up the mountain in the middle of winter. Ephraim did not answer. He turned the page and kept reading, because Josiah Vane had already begun answering the question himself. The entries from February of 1881 grew increasingly cautious. Josiah had written that he no longer lit fires during the daytime, for fear that the smoke rising through the natural vent might be spotted from below. He had written that he had begun carrying his provisions into the cave only at night, and only during heavy snowfall, so that his tracks would be covered by morning. He had written that he had begun to suspect the mining company was not interested in the trapper who used the cave, but in the cave itself, in its warmth, in its water, in whatever mineral content gave the pool its peculiar smell. And on one page, dated the 22nd of February, Josiah had written a single line that Ephraim read 3 times before speaking it aloud. The line read, "The company man told me in town today that a warm spring under a claim boundary belongs to the claim holder, not the finder. That is all he said, but that is enough." Hannah understood before Ephraim finished the sentence. She had grown up in a mining town herself, farther west, and she knew what that kind of remark meant when it came from a company man. It meant that Josiah Vane had been given a warning. It meant that the mining company had discovered the cave existed. And it meant that Josiah, if he wanted to keep the shelter that had saved his life the winter before, would have to defend it somehow, or lose it entirely to a corporation with more lawyers than any trapper could ever afford to hire. The next several entries described Josiah's response. He had begun, quietly and without telling anyone in town, to build a case for his own claim to the cave. He had measured the distance from the Black Cliff to the nearest surveyed mining boundary and recorded it in the back of the journal, along with a rough sketch of the terrain. He had gathered samples of the mineral deposits along the pool's edge and wrapped them carefully in oiled cloth. He had ridden twice to the county land office, 40 miles east, to inquire about the process for filing a natural spring claim on unpatented land. And on the 3rd of March, 1881, he had written a final short entry that stopped Ephraim cold. The entry read, "Rode into town this morning. Sheriff pulled me aside outside the general store, told me the company had filed papers claiming the north face of Kestrel Mountain under a mineral extension clause. Told me the papers were dated last October. Told me I had 30 days to vacate any structure or shelter I had built on the disputed ground. I did not tell him about the journal. I did not tell him about the crate. I did not tell him where I have been sleeping this winter. I told him I understood, and I rode back up the mountain. If they come for the cave, they will have to find it first." There were no further entries after that. Ephraim turned the remaining pages slowly, one after another, but every page was blank. Josiah Vane had stopped writing on the 3rd of March, 1881, and whatever had happened to him after that had not been recorded in this journal. Ephraim closed the book gently and set it back on the old cloth beside the crate. For a long moment, no one in the chamber spoke. Even the gurgle of the pool seemed quieter now, as if the cave itself had been listening. Silas broke the silence first. The boy asked in a small voice whether the mining company had ever found the cave. Ephraim thought about that question carefully before answering. He looked around the chamber, at the crate that had not been opened in 45 years, at the tools that had not been touched, at the journal that had not been read. He told Silas the truth, which was that he did not know. But he told the boy what he could reason from the evidence. If the mining company had found the cave, they would have stripped it. They would have hauled out the crate. They would have taken the tools. They would have driven stakes into the pool's edges and marked the walls with survey chalk. None of that had happened. The cave had been left exactly as Josiah Vane had last seen it, which meant one of two things. Either Josiah had died on the mountain before he could return, and the company had never located the entrance, or Josiah had lived long enough to hide the cave so thoroughly that even a determined survey crew had failed to find it. Ephraim suspected the second, because a man who had gone to the trouble of banking his cook fires against the wall to hide the smoke was not a man who died carelessly. Hannah asked the harder question. She asked whether the mining company still held the claim. Ephraim did not know the answer to that either, but he told her what he did know. He told her that the mine on the western slope was still operating, still owned by the same corporation that had operated it 45 years earlier, and that if any old claim on the north face of Kestrel Mountain still existed on paper somewhere in the county land office, the corporation almost certainly still held it. Which meant, in practical terms, that the cave they were sitting inside might still legally belong to the same company whose crews had been pulled off the upper ridge 2 days before by the surveyor named Corbin Vale. Ephraim did not say the next part aloud, but Hannah understood it anyway. If Corbin Vale had walked the upper ridge with instruments no one in the valley had ever seen, and had come back down white-faced, then Corbin Vale had almost certainly known that the mountain was about to move, which meant the mining company had known, which meant the decision to pull the crews down had been made not to save the workers below, but to protect the corporation from the liability of losing them. And the fact that no warning had been given to the families living along the eastern ridge, no bell rung in time to evacuate the road, no wagon sent to the outlying cabins, meant that the corporation had made a choice about which lives were worth warning and which lives were not. Ephraim did not know if that thought made him more angry or more grateful. Angry because his neighbors along the road were probably dying at that very moment beneath the weight of a slide the company had seen coming. Grateful because if the company had warned everyone, the cave would have been discovered decades earlier, and his family would have had nowhere to run tonight. He set that thought aside and turned back to the practical work of survival. The cave was warm. The pool provided water. The crate, when he pried it open with the old mining pick, revealed contents that had somehow survived nearly half a century in the steady mineral air. Salt pork, hard as leather but still edible once soaked. Dried corn in a sealed tin, still golden, still whole. A small sack of coffee beans, dark and fragrant when Ephraim broke the seal. A brick of hard tack wrapped in wax paper. It was not enough to feed a family of 5 for a whole winter. But it was enough, combined with the provisions Hannah had grabbed from the mudroom, to buy them time. Time to understand what had happened to the valley outside. Time to decide what to do next. Ephraim organized the chamber the way he organized his forge at home, everything in its proper place. Silas was put in charge of tending the small cook fire Ephraim built against the old blackened wall, using cedar kindling from the crate and a few careful sticks of driftwood Hannah had thought to grab on the way out. Ada was given the task of watching Wren, who woke briefly to eat a small portion of hard tack softened in warm pool water, then fell asleep again against Juno's flank. Hannah began sorting their provisions into rations, dividing everything into small daily portions that would stretch a week, maybe 10 days if they were careful, before the family would need to venture back outside to look for more. The first night in the cave passed more peacefully than any night Ephraim could remember. The warmth of the chamber was steady, not the sharp intermittent heat of a stove that had to be fed every hour, but the slow ambient warmth of a place that had held its temperature for centuries. The children slept deeply. Hannah, who had not slept more than 4 hours a night since the storm warnings began, finally allowed herself to close her eyes against Ephraim's shoulder near the wall. Juno kept watch by the passage entrance, her ears twitching at the muffled sounds of the storm outside, but she did not growl once. Whatever she had sensed in the yard that afternoon, she did not sense inside the cave. That was, in its own quiet way, the most reassuring thing that had happened to Ephraim in 3 days. When morning came, or when Ephraim guessed it had come based on the slow shift of light through the natural vent above, he crawled back through the narrow passage to look outside. He had to dig his way through nearly 4 feet of fresh snow before he could raise his head above the drift. What he saw stopped him for a long time. The valley below was gone. Not gone in the sense of hidden, gone in the sense of erased. Where the wagon road should have run, there was only a wide white expanse of packed avalanche debris. Where the neighbor's cabin should have stood on the lower ridge, there were only splintered roof lines protruding from the snow like broken teeth. Where the church steeple should have risen above the town, there was nothing at all. Ephraim stood in the snow for a full minute before he understood what he was seeing. The avalanche had come down not once but twice. The first slide, which he had heard beginning the day before, had swept away the road and the lower cabins. The second, which must have come sometime in the night, had descended from higher up and buried the town itself. Copper Vein Basin as a settlement no longer existed. The mining company's compound on the western slope was gone. The general store was gone. The saloon was gone. The church was gone. Whatever survivors remained were somewhere beneath that white surface, and Ephraim knew from 34 years of mountain living that most of them would not be dug out alive. He climbed back down through the passage and told Hannah what he had seen. He did not soften it, because Hannah was not the kind of woman who could be helped by a softened truth. She listened without expression, and when he was finished, she asked only one question. She asked whether he had seen any smoke rising from anywhere in the valley, any smoke at all. Ephraim told her he had not. Hannah closed her eyes for a long moment, and then she opened them and began to divide the day's rations. The Doyle family stayed in the cave for 11 days. During that time, Ephraim ventured outside twice more, each time to look for signs of other survivors and each time to return with the same answer. Once on the 4th day, he saw a thin column of smoke rising from the far southern end of the valley near the old Peterson homestead, and he set out on foot through the snow to reach it. It took him 7 hours to cover the 2 miles. When he arrived, he found the Peterson family, all 4 of them, sheltering inside the wreckage of their collapsed barn, alive but frostbitten, burning the last of their firewood. He led them back to the cave through the deep snow, and by nightfall the chamber held 9 people instead of 5. The Petersons did not question the cave. They saw the pool, felt the warmth, ate the hardtack Hannah offered them, and simply began to weep. Old Mrs. Peterson, who had lived in Copper Vein Basin since before the mining company arrived, sat beside the pool for a long time and then said, very quietly, that her grandfather had once told her about a warm cave beneath the Black Cliff. She had thought it was a story. She had thought it was the kind of thing old men said to frighten children away from dangerous places. She had not understood until that moment that some warnings were told not to protect children from the danger, but to protect the danger from the children. Ephraim thought about that for a long time after Mrs. Peterson said it. He thought about the old prospector at the general store, and the crossed fingers, and the warnings that had circulated in Copper Vein Basin for 45 years. He thought about Josiah Vane, who had almost certainly started those warnings himself, feeding them into the town gossip network the way a man feeds bait into a trap. If the cave was cursed, no one would look for it. If the cliff was haunted, no company surveyor would climb it. If the black rock swallowed men whole, the mining corporation would file its papers and forget the claim ever existed. Josiah Vane had not hidden the cave with lies about geography. He had hidden it with lies about fear. And the lies had held for nearly half a century, long after Josiah himself was gone, long after the men who had first spread the stories had died and been buried in the town cemetery that no longer existed. The rescue party from the county seat reached the valley on the 15th day after the avalanche. By then, Ephraim had led two more small groups of survivors to the cave, an elderly couple from the eastern pasture, whose sod-roofed cabin had held against the slide by pure accident of geography, and a young woman named Ruth Havermill, whose husband had died beside her in the collapse of their kitchen, but who had walked 6 miles through the snow with a broken wrist to reach the smoke Ephraim had allowed to rise once each morning from the natural vent. When the rescuers finally arrived at the base of the Black Cliff, following that column of smoke, they found 17 people alive inside a chamber the county had never known existed. The mining corporation sent lawyers within a week. Ephraim had expected that. The lawyers came with old survey maps and older claim papers, and they explained, in the patient tone lawyers use when explaining things they expect no one to argue with, that the north face of Kestrel Mountain fell within the mineral extension boundary filed in October of 1878, and that any natural resource located within that boundary belonged to the corporation. Ephraim listened without interrupting. When the lawyers were finished, he handed them Josiah Vane's journal. He had spent 11 nights in the cave reading and rereading that journal, and he had come to understand two things. The first was that Josiah Vane's measurements, recorded in the back pages in careful pencil, placed the cave entrance 42 feet outside the mineral extension boundary, as it had been originally filed. The second was that the corporation's later expansion of that boundary, filed in the spring of 1881, had been dated after Josiah's disappearance and had been signed by a company surveyor whose name matched the surveyor Josiah had reported following him up the mountain. The paperwork was, in the plainest possible terms, a fraud built on top of a man's death. The lawyers took the journal, read it in silence at Hannah's kitchen table in the temporary cabin the county had built for the Doyles that spring, and left without another word. The corporation did not send lawyers again. The cave passed formally into Ephraim Doyle's ownership by the end of that summer, along with 60 acres of surrounding land the county judge determined had never been legally claimed by anyone else. Ephraim did not sell it. He did not commercialize the spring. He did not allow the newspapers from Cheyenne to photograph the chamber. What he did instead was build a small stone lodge at the base of the Black Cliff, with a proper insulated passage leading down into the cave itself, and every winter after that, for the rest of his life, the lodge stood open to any family in the region whose home had failed them. Nobody was ever charged to enter. Nobody was ever turned away. The valley remembered that winter for a long time. Not because Copper Vein Basin had been destroyed, though it had. Not because the mining corporation had been exposed, though it had been. The valley remembered because of what one man had chosen to do with a shelter he had not built and had not deserved and had only found because a dog had barked at a hill nobody wanted to look at. Would you have followed the road toward town like everyone else? Or would you have trusted the dog barking at the cliff? Let me know in the comments below. And if this story moved you, please hit like and subscribe so more stories like this one can find the viewers who need them most.